All right, everyone. First, I would love to welcome everyone for joining in tonight. Tonight is this is not a hardcore webinar where I'm going to be teaching you some really crazy or really complex biology. Hopefully, I never really get into really complex stuff, but we're able to explain it in ways that you can. But this is unlike any of my other webinars where I'm trying to teach you about animal behavior or wildlife behavior or any other principles in wildlife. I gotta sneeze. Excuse me. All right. That should be done. Usually 3 sneezes and I'm done. But I guess that's a good reminder that not only am I live, but I wasn't kidding you when I said I'm still a little bit under the weather. Um, but anyway, tonight's webinar, Animal Tales. This is not a teaching type of webinar. It's more of an entertainment, but it's also to inspire your minds and get you thinking and enjoying wildlife as much as I do. I'm pretty sure most of you already do that. But this class would be really good. So once I send you the recording, if you know anyone, any young student or anyone thinking of going to college to become a wildlife biologist or thinking this might be a career for them, by all means send them this webinar, because all I want to do today is kind of talk about the things that I get to do. And without a doubt, I know I am the luckiest man in the entire world because I absolutely love what I do for a living. And so you most know that I'm not going to be rich or get rich doing any of this stuff. And so the fact of the matter is that I wake up wanting to go to work. I've never worked a day in my life because it's literally you're waking up doing things that you absolutely love to do. And I would strongly encourage that for any young student, anyone considering or trying to figure out what they want to do with the rest of their life. Heck, do whatever you want to do that makes you happy, and you'll never work a day in your life. So with that, what I'm going to do, I just saw the bless you. Thank you for the bless yous. Hopefully I won't interrupt you again with any more sneezing. I will tell you I'll probably cough before the night is over. So what I'm going to do, and again, most of you know who I am and my experience, but in case you do send this to anyone, I do like giving a little bit of my background so people viewing this for the very first time kind of know who I am and the fact that I do have experience. It's not just because I'm reading books here at home, but I actually live this life. And so obviously my name is Daryl Radijak. I'm a wildlife biologist. But I have been so fortunate, and I love doing these talks with Kim Delosier because he sees things exactly as I do. We are insanely blessed being able to do the work that we love to do. And some of the jobs I've had throughout my career, which spans over 20 years right now, I'm getting up there in age, but one of the first jobs I ever had to introduce me into this world, after I got my degree in wildlife management, I became the manager of the Appalachian Bear Center in East Tennessee. Many of you know that as the Appalachian Bear Rescue now. I did that for almost 5 years. It was absolutely fantastic. It was so much smaller back then. Very rudimentary in everything we had. We had literally no money to do much. And so I am so thrilled, so excited, and so impressed with what the Bear Center has become. And so it was truly a wonderful start to my career. That's where my passion for bears actually blossomed. But after I left that Bear Center, I did start working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, which is the state wildlife agency for Tennessee. And because of that bear experience I had, I was soon promoted to the bear, deer, and elk coordinator. Sometimes I only mention if I'm doing a bear talk, I only say the bear part of it. But for many of you, in case you didn't know, I was over the white-tailed deer program as well as the elk program in the state of Tennessee. So a couple of my stories tonight will be drawing from those experiences, and hopefully these will be some new stories that some of you hear tonight. Anyway, I did that for about 7 years where I was over the bear, deer, and elk program. And that was an awesome job. I got to do some amazing things out there. But because the director of the agency was a little weird, he saw something in me and he promoted me to chief of wildlife, which then put me above or in charge of all animals in the state of Tennessee. So besides having all those large mammal experiences, I was then over waterfowl, bats, birds, you name it. It fell under my direction while I was chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. And that was awesome. The only bad thing with that is I was out of the field most of the time. I was attending meetings and conferences, and I truly do miss interacting with people. Don't miss interacting with commissioners and politicians, but I really did miss interacting with people. And one of my lifelong dreams was living and working out west. And so almost 3 years ago now, I made the leap, left Tennessee, and headed west to New Mexico. And now I'm a wildlife biologist out here. I get to do a whole lot more outdoor stuff. But what's really, really awesome is I get to do this stuff. These presentations, talking to people all over North America about wildlife. And when those people are just as passionate as I am, I could talk all night long. I'm going to try not to do that tonight. I'll hopefully keep you only an hour or so, but I will stay as long as you want. But that's my experience. Many of you have known this already for a long, long time. And this is mostly for the benefit of anyone who might get this recording. So with that, you all follow along on Facebook, or most of you follow along on Facebook, and one of the advertisements that I did recently was about Black Panthers. And so I am going to start this whole discussion tonight. It's just going to be a series of stories, experiences that I had as a wildlife biologist. But I'm going to stop quite a bit to see if you have questions or comments or anything. I want you to steer where we go, because I got a whole slew of stories in the hopper. But I'm going to start with the first one and start talking about the Black Panther. Now, I know some of you have attended my cat classes, whether or not it was Colossal Cats or Cougar Country, and I talk about what cats are native to North America, and hopefully all the ones that have attended that class of mine know that there is only one considered large cat in North America, and that is called the cougar, Felis concolor, or Puma concolor, and otherwise known as a mountain lion. And it goes by many, many names. And there are many, many stories of people seeing mountain lions all over the country. I dealt with a ton of them in Tennessee. Cougars are primarily a western cat, but we do have stragglers every once in a while that wander over east of the Mississippi River. The one thing that we do not have, and I'm bursting bubbles here already, we do not have black panthers in North America. Now, people will swear by it. They will call me a liar because they saw it with their own two eyes. And the problem with that observation of a black panther is the fact that a panther is an animal that belongs to specific species. And a panther is either a melanistic or black version of a leopard or a black version of a jaguar. Now, leopards are found in Africa and Southeast Asia. Jaguars are found in South America and Central America. And so jaguars and leopards are not native to North America. Now, there is a little caveat there in the fact that a jaguar or a couple of jaguars have wandered up into the Arizona area. If you're all familiar with that, I hope you're just so knowledgeable about that. There's a couple of their kind of famous cats, but they're right on that Mexican border, and there's only two, and both of them are just regular coloration. So needless to say, black panthers do not exist in North America. Never been documented. There's also never been a melanistic or black version of a cougar within recorded history. It just doesn't happen. It's believed they don't even carry the gene. But I will tell you, as chief of wildlife and as that big game coordinator, I receive dozens and dozens and dozens of calls about black panthers. And people swear by it. Like I said, they call me a liar. So needless to say, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, had a woman contact me from Middle Tennessee, probably about 45 minutes south of Nashville, and was telling me about a black panther that has been harassing her and her horses. And so I tried to explain to her, and a few days went by, and she tried calling back, and again, I told her that we didn't have those. I don't know what exactly she was seeing, and she was certain she had a black panther. And this is a picture of kind of her proof. Now, I don't know if you could see this black panther here, but it's a dot. And this is what I had to deal with. But she was certain that black panther was wandering the back 40 of her property and was chasing her cows and harassing her horses. And so literally that is what she was trying to tell me. Needless to say, I did not want to pursue this any further, but this said woman, bless her heart, and you always have to wonder about her whenever you bless someone's heart like that, she was adamant on what she was seeing and very persistent. And so she ended up going all the way up to the director. I'm sorry, not the director, the governor of Tennessee somehow got to his office and was just complaining how our agency was just unhelpful in solving her black panther. So needless to say, the director of our agency approached me, and he knew I was familiar with the woman, and he said, "Daryl, I hate to do this to you, but can you please go out and talk with her and try to help her out?" So would you believe, as a wildlife biologist for the state of Tennessee, I was actually chief of wildlife at the time, I had to go out there and spoke with her. She toured me all around her property, and I ended up having to hang cameras, trail cameras, all over her property to capture this black panther because she knew exactly what she had. And so literally spending many, many days, not just setting up the cameras, but retrieving the cards and combing through pictures, I ended up getting a picture of the black panther. And again, this cost taxpayer money, so to speak, where I had to go out here, and here is the black panther that I finally caught on camera roaming her property. And the sad thing about this is I showed her all these pictures. I had multiple pictures. Beautiful black lab. The funny thing is she always described this panther as coming out right before dark. And the pictures of this black lab were always right before dark or just after dark. It was running around with a golden lab, which I'm surprised she didn't have a black panther and a cougar wandering her property. But that was literally the time I had to catch a black panther. But that is not the end of the story, just so you know. This woman was, like I said, she was nice. She was persistent. She knew exactly what she saw. Believe it or not, after showing her these pictures, she didn't believe I caught the right animal. And fortunately, a few weeks went by, and I didn't hear anything from her, but I received a phone call about another black panther that was captured on film. And it was, when she gave me the address, it was like right next door to this place. And I asked if this woman knew this other woman who had the black panther issue, and she said, yes, that's my mom. So apparently they work in tandem. And so the daughter of this person captured a real life picture of a black panther on their property. And what it was, if you haven't seen this picture, it was, you can't see it too well, there is a cow carcass. They ran a cattle farm, and one of the cows had died, and a black panther, which you see at the bottom right of that screen, had showed up to feed on the carcass. And she captured this picture, and she stopped short of going to the news agency because she wanted to show it to me first. And if you could zoom in there, you can't see it too well. That's the best I could do of zooming in. But that's what it looked like. These are exactly the kind of pictures and evidence that I would get as wildlife biologists of these creatures that are not supposed to exist. So obviously, looking at that picture, you couldn't tell much because it was blurry. It kind of has the shape of a cat, but you can't really tell what it is. Once again, the director came to me and said, "Can you please go sort this out?" So believe it or not, I go back out there. I actually walked all the way back to the property where this cow still wasn't smelling too good. But I had to take a whole bunch of measurements. I had an assistant help me out, but we took a whole bunch of measurements to try to figure out how big this animal was that she got a picture of. Still didn't know what it was, but we're trying to get an idea of size. And sure enough, it was much larger than a house cat. And so we were trying to figure out what it was, and as I was talking to the daughter of this woman, she was pretty excited that she got a picture of a black panther, which has never been photographed in North America before. And she asked me, well, she told me, if you like that, wait until you see the picture of the wolf I got. And so my ears perked up. I'm like, oh, you got a wolf. Now, hopefully some of you have attended my wolf class, but timber wolves or gray wolves, they are native to North America, but they're nowhere near Tennessee. The closest populations of wolves in North America are in the western half of the Great Lakes, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. There's a few thousand animals up there. Outside of that, we have some wolves in Yellowstone, but everything else is to the north. They're all throughout Canada and Alaska, but nothing even remotely close. Wisconsin is the closest state that has wolves to Tennessee, but she had a picture of a black panther and a wolf. So I asked her if I could go see a picture of the wolf. And so she took me to her barn because she kept her computer in her barn for some reason. And she was flipping through the pages or all the pictures that she had acquired. And picture after picture were pictures of these coyotes that were coming in to feed on this cow carcass. And one of them was melanistic. It was, what I mean by that, it was a black coyote. And as soon as that black one showed up, she's like, see, there's the wolf. And I tried to explain to her that that wasn't a wolf, that was just a melanistic version of a coyote. And the thing that was so interesting, and I'm hoping you can see the cursor on the screen, but the picture of the black panther she captured, there's this miscoloration on the chest of the animal. And so as I'm scrolling through her pictures, I wanted to see that melanistic coyote and whether or not it had a chest blaze, and that coyote would never turn towards the camera. And finally, the very last picture on the camera roll was this picture, and this is that melanistic or black coyote turning its head. But you see down here, the bottom right has a white chest blaze, and it matched up perfectly with her black panther. So I killed two birds. I completely crushed her because she no longer had a black panther. She no longer had a wolf on camera. But this is something I love talking about this because I don't want to dispel what people believe they saw, but I love getting to the bottom of things. And so the cool thing with this is once I showed her this, put two and two together, we lined up the pictures, the light bulb went off. And that's one of the most rewarding things when it comes to teaching people is they're convinced in their ways, but as long as you could show them evidence and put it in such a way that is not condescending, it works really well for them. Not all the time, but most of the time. And so, believe it or not, I've had black panther experience, even though I was the wildlife biologist in the state of Tennessee. So, just a quick question: has anyone, and I'm not gonna, this isn't to criticize, has anyone thought they saw a black panther or even a cougar? I promise you, everyone will know someone that has seen a black panther or a cougar. Now, Kelly, you can't type here. You're in California. You do have cougars out there. Yeah, and believe it or not, that's the cool thing because I teach a lot of the cougar classes. I have yet to encounter a cougar in the wild. They are so elusive. But we get pictures of them all the time on cameras, and that is one of the hardest things, and it's a pet peeve of mine. All the sightings that occur in the east, I'm not saying they're all misidentifications because occasionally a cat can wander through, but it's extremely, extremely rare. I would say 99.9% of them are misidentifications. But every once in a while, a cat does go through. We had one in Tennessee, one showed up in Kentucky, and then one came up from Florida up into Georgia. So it is possible, but the eyes are the easiest thing to fool. And the next cougar class I give, I'm going to have a demonstration of to see whether or not people can recognize a cat from a quick view. So anyway, let's see. What I love, Trish, is and it's probably because I talk to a whole lot of people, the old timers. A lot of them will say they can identify a Black Panther by the scream it makes, and I always I always wondered how you could differentiate color because through a sound that an animal makes. Chanda, where exactly do you live? I forget. Are you up in New Jersey, New Hampshire? Yeah. Now, when it comes to cougars, there was a cougar that was killed in Connecticut, and I believe that was like 2011. Uh, that cat actually came from the Dakotas, went all the way across the Great Lakes through the northern part of New York, Vermont. Um, I think it had to go through New Hampshire, but it ended up getting killed in Connecticut. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. We just have, when I say we don't have them in the East Coast, we don't have any breeding, reproducing populations, no year-round residents of them. And so, like I said, a sighting could happen, but most of the time it's misidentification. So, okay, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put it to a vote because I've got a couple of animal stories that I could jump to, and I'll probably blank my screen as I jump to it. But I'm going to ask you right now: do you want to hear a bear story, an elk story, or a deer story? Elk. Okay. Let me let me pause my screen here and see if I could jump to the elk. Okay. What I'm going to do now, I've done a webinar um, regarding Kim Delosier and I did a Return of the Bugle, but I just used that caption because we're going to be talking about elk. Now I will tell you again, this is the amazing, lucky, wonderful life I have led as wildlife biologist, and hopefully will continue to lead for the rest of my career. I don't plan on retiring, and I got to make sure nobody hears that. Um, but one of the coolest things that I had to do as that big game coordinator for the state of Tennessee, many people know that elk are not um, they're not found in many places on the East Coast. Now, historically, they were. Elk were extirpated; they were killed out hundreds of years ago, and so they used to be all over the East Coast. In fact, there is a subspecies, and many of you know how much that irks me, but eastern elk used to be all over the eastern half of North America. But those were all completely wiped out, most of them being wiped out in the 1800s. And so some states started returning them. Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, a number of states have done that. And so one of the things that was one of the greatest highlights of my career, when I started working for the agency, we had already released some elk into the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area, which is north of Knoxville. And so we had a small herd there. That initial release of elk, we released about 160 animals. And you have to understand, when you release animals, they tend not to do really good right out of the gate because they're in a new territory. They don't know where to find food. They don't know where to find water. They're completely out of their element. And so sometimes they don't do so well, usually have high mortality the first couple of years. And so the Tennessee elk herd dropped down to maybe just over 100 animals, and we really wanted to bolster that population again. And so after I was promoted into that big game coordinator position, we started a project where we're going to get more elk. Now, originally, we received our elk from Elk Island National Park, which is in Alberta, Canada. And our intention was to drive up to Canada and get another shipment. In fact, we had them capture about 100 elk for us, and they were all processed, ready to go. These were wild elk that we were going to get. But then, would you believe that there's people out there that are not very nice people? They sued us. They filed an injunction so we could not bring elk back into Tennessee because we had put a restriction, a moratorium on the public purchasing and bringing in elk. It used to be legal, it still is legal for people to buy elk and keep them as pets. But because of this disease called chronic wasting disease, and Trish, you should know about that because I told you about it a couple of days ago. Because of the threat of this chronic wasting disease, we told the public they could not bring elk in because we didn't want them to introduce a disease. And so what they did is they filed an injunction to prevent us, the state agency, from doing the same thing. Because if it wasn't good for them, it shouldn't be good for us. And so they did have somewhat of a point there, but we had very rigorous disease testing going on, which they're not usually required to do. But anyway, we could not get the elk from Canada. So we had to look for a different source. Now, there was a place it's called Land Between the Lakes. It's a national reserve area. It's not a national park. But it's in between the border of Kentucky and Tennessee. And it's in between a couple of lakes. That's why it's called Land Between the Lakes. The cool thing with that area is they have what's called an elk and bison enclosure. It's been there for almost 100 years. And so they have a small herd of elk and a small herd of bison within this enclosure. Now, this enclosure is not something small. It was 1 mile, it was 1 square mile. So you know how big a mile is. It's pretty big. So you drive your car in there. You could drive around to view the elk. Once you go in the gate, it closes behind you so none of the animals can get out. So it's a really large enclosure. And every so often they have surplus animals because the elk and bison in there reproduce, and they have to get rid of their surplus animals so they don't overpopulate. And so they had a herd of just over 100 elk. I think it was like 112 elk, and they were going to give us 40 of them. And so they contacted us, and can you imagine this? If this was your job, this is how lucky I am. Myself and a number of other biologists, we had to go over there, and for a period of about it lasted almost 3 weeks actually. Our job was to go in there with dart guns and to sedate all the elk. Now remember, they're in this large enclosure. You can't even see the fence in many of the spots that we had to go. So we literally had to hunt the elk with dart guns for a number of weeks until we rounded up everyone. We had to sedate every elk in that enclosure so we could test it before we could get those animals. And because those animals were already in Tennessee, we didn't have any worry about someone filing an injunction on us. So one of the coolest things that I remember of that adventure was talking to the head biologist from the Fish and Wildlife Service who was there. He was instructing on some of the drugs we were using to sedate these animals. And you have to understand, an elk is a big animal. It can be 700 pounds. And the drugs we were using, one of them was called carfentanil, which is really, really potent. And 1 mil, which is not a lot, 1 mil will put down a 700-pound bull elk. And so I remember sitting in the training and they were talking about how if you accidentally inject yourself, and say you stabbed your finger with a dart, or this is the scary part, if it sprayed and got misted and it got in your eye, they had these series of shots that you had to administer every 20 minutes as you frantically made your way to the hospital to receive treatment because of this drug, because it'll shut down everything. And so that was when you're sitting in class hearing about that, you're like, huh, this is the real thing. But that wasn't the best part. I think the best part was after they talked to us about the dangers of that drug we're using, they're like, if that isn't enough, if you happen to dart an elk, it'll go down usually within a matter of a few minutes. And the thing that you have to do with an elk when they lay on their side, if they're sedated, they start having trouble with their respiration because the weight, they typically don't lay down on their sides, and the weight of their animal kind of collapses their lung. So what you have to do is you have to sit them up in this position called sternal recumbency. It's a really technical term. I'm surprised I remember it, but it's kind of a neat term. It means you have to get them up sitting upwards. They can't be laying down on their side. You gotta prop them up and hold them up so they breathe okay. And so that didn't seem so bad, but what they said is for some reason or another, it seems to draw attention when you have an elk down on the ground and a couple of people around it handling it. For some reason, it draws the attention of the bison. Now, I'm sure many of you know very well about bison and how dangerous they can be in Yellowstone because they're huge animals. Their head looks like the size of a Volkswagen sometimes. And so what you had to do is when you're working with these elk, oftentimes a herd of bison would wander by, and they would kind of crowd you in, and it becomes a dangerous situation. And so we had to draw straws amongst the biologists, and the shortest straw had to serve as decoy for the bison. Now, fortunately, we had ATVs that we could drive around, but whenever an elk went down and the bison started moving in, lo and behold, myself a couple of days and someone else in a few other days, we would be the decoy. We'd be the bison decoy to lure all those guys around. Fortunately, they didn't really pursue hard, but you definitely had to play the rodeo clown with a herd of bison, which can be unsettling sometimes when you get close enough to them. Anyway, long story short, this picture here was after we had gathered up all the elk in that enclosure, and we got the 40 that they were given to us that we were going to release into the wild. You could see what a day it was. I did have more pictures of here because there's another story behind this, but it was a wintry day high up in the mountains of North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area. Very rugged place, but we had this beautiful meadow. We backed up all the trailers, and and we did this elk release. And I don't have really good pictures to do it justice, but to be part of a program where you're capturing these huge, monstrous animals and you're releasing them into the wild in your state, you cannot ask for a more rewarding experience. Now, not every single elk that we released was was an adult. There were some calves in there. And I'm laughing here because it just reminded me, and like I said, I could talk for days on end about different stories here. But during this release, we had a crowd of people. There was probably 200 or 300 people lined up on the hillside. We did cordon it off so no one could get too close as we released these animals, and they burst out of the trailer. But as any wildlife biologist will tell you, if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. And so one of the calves that we were releasing apparently hadn't fed in a while, and it was weak. So it stumbled out of the trailer. It was okay, but it stumbled out, but is having trouble walking. And when the calf finally left the trailer, there was a big cheer from the crowd. You could hear it up on the hillside. You hear, "Hooray!" and then the calf would fall down, and you could hear the crowd go, oh, and the calf would get back up, and they're like, hooray, and then it'd fall down, and it kept doing this, and the calf would get up, and then it'd fall down, and the crowd was reacting, and we were sitting here like, oh my gosh, this is not good. And so we had the one gentleman who was a very large man. He was like 6'6", 350 pounds. He walked out into the middle of the field and picked the calf up and walked it over to the edge, so at least it got into the wood line where the crowd wouldn't see it anymore. As far as we know, the calf reunited with its mom and was able to nurse and get health back. But boy, oh boy, you talk about highs and lows, ups and downs, but being a part of something as awesome as releasing animals into a new area for the first time, I can't tell you a more rewarding experience. It was just absolutely incredible. So let me switch to see if anyone has any comments here. I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk more about elk, but I'm gonna go in a little bit different direction. I see Lori, you're typing anything. I'm gonna take a quick drink really quick. Has anyone? It's doubtful. It doesn't happen much, but has anyone been like on a bear release or actually, I think someone, if I recall correctly, on Facebook just released a Cooper's hawk. I don't know if that was any of you guys. All right, Chanda, that's a really good question. Chanda asks, how do you determine how big a new herd should be? And it's as big as it wants to get. And usually what limits that, Chanda, is the land, the amount of food that the land can produce. Now, you have to understand elk primarily are grazers. That means they love eating grasses and other things that you find in open meadows. Now, where a lot of these elk were reintroduced, there's a lot of forest. You can see an open meadow here, but there's not a lot of them. And so because this land here does not have the food base that these elk need, their herd's not going to grow very, very large. Right now they estimate the Tennessee elk herd somewhere between 400 to 500 animals. It varies. It's really hard. In fact, I'm going to talk about that next, actually. But it all depends on what the land can support. And so we don't put a limit on it. We don't say we only want X amount and that's all we're going to have. We let the animals tell us how many are going to be out there. Now, the thing to remember, whenever you release animals to a new area, their population usually goes up. After a while, it usually goes up. Then it goes above where it should be, and then it'll drop down and settle out. That's called carrying capacity. But that's where literally the land dictates how many animals could be on the landscape and how many animals it could support. So really good question. Lori has another good question about, do we predetermine how many males and females? Generally what we're going for whenever we're trying to restore a population, especially with these ungulates, these deer and elk, what you're trying to do is release as many females as you can. You don't need a lot of males, and I'm sure many of you will agree that males are not really important, because if you have, say you have 100 animals in the population, you don't need 50 males and 50 females. Remember, those females are what's going to be adding to the population. They're getting pregnant, they're giving birth. Now, you don't need one male for every female in order for those females to get pregnant. Literally, you need one male and 99 females. You'll have a really tired male at the end of it, but all those females are going to be pregnant. And so whenever you're restoring a population, you try to overload it with the females because you know they're still going to get pregnant, and the more females you have in a population, the faster that population will grow. So whenever you're doing a release or a restocking effort, you try to weight it more towards females because you know that'll build your population a whole lot faster. Oh, Shirley's been on eagle releases. I've been on those too. Those are actually really cool. It's awesome getting up close and personal, especially with a larger animal that you're getting ready to release. GNES, is there a species survival plan for elk? It, another term for that is a strategic plan. Yes, there is. I don't know. I know they are revising a number of the plans for the state of Tennessee, and so I don't know where this one stands. But most state wildlife agencies have a plan of how they're to manage animals. I know in Tennessee we did, and I'm almost certain every other state. If you dig deep enough into the state wildlife agency, they should have strategic plans with how they're supposed to manage the animals. Trish brought up a subject that I could talk all night long. I won't do it tonight, but Trish mentions chronic wasting disease. Do they not develop any natural immunity? Nothing passed from mother to offspring? Does it happen every year? Only problem for deer or elk also? Lots of questions there. I'll try to be quick. Chronic wasting disease is awful. There are lots of diseases out there that inflict animals, especially deer. A big one is called epizootic hemorrhagic disease, EHD. And that disease is fatal in white-tailed deer, and it is transmitted by a little biting insect, a gnat, so to speak. And during the early part of summer, when those little midges are breeding around stagnant water, if they carry this EHD virus and they bite the deer gets it and the deer dies. And it's usually really quick. And so sometimes you have these EHD outbreaks, epizootic hemorrhagic disease outbreaks in white-tailed deer, and it affects them quickly. The deer become emaciated, they become really thirsty, and they seek water, and they die by water sources. And so sometimes you'll go to a pond and you'll find 3 or 4 dead deer there. A couple of farms over, there'll be more animals there. And it's really devastating because in that localized area, it can really hurt the population. But it's usually really localized, and so it's not widespread everywhere. The thing that's really good and fortunate about EHD is as soon as there's cold weather and it kills those midges, those biting insects, that disease disappears. And the cool thing with that is the deer that survive, they have somewhat of an immunity to that disease. And so usually the herd is protected for a number of years to come, 7, 10 years to come. They don't have to worry about another EHD outbreak because the deer in that area have an immunity to it. That is natural. That's something that happens quite often in lots of animals, lots of different diseases. Chronic wasting disease is this nasty thing. It was first described in 1967 in Colorado, and it is called a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. See, I knew I'd end up teaching you guys something. It's a TSE. The thing that's scary about those is if you've ever heard of mad cow disease in England when that occurred, it's the same family of diseases. The human form is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And what it is, instead of being a virus or a bacteria, it's this misshapen prion. It's a protein that's misshapen, and it starts accumulating in your brain. And once it accumulates, it starts to perforate your brain, and it's eventually it will cause mortality. And so usually it takes 2 years for that to cause the mortality in an animal. The thing that is so scary about this chronic wasting disease, now just understand, as of right now, it only affects members of the deer family. So white-tailed deer, elk, mule deer, moose, reindeer, they can get this chronic wasting disease. The thing that's so bad with it is there is no end, meaning it doesn't get wiped out by the cold, doesn't get wiped out by temperature or anything like that. So once it gets into a herd, you might have an infection rate of less than 1% when it first gets introduced. But then more and more animals get infected. And the bad thing, this is why it's really, really bad, we're paying attention to it, it stays in the environment. These proteins don't die out. And so if an animal gets sick and dies, that carcass will lay on the ground and deteriorate, and that infectious agent, that protein, will still be in the ground. And so another animal or another deer could come by and pick it up. So it starts building in prevalence. And so when you start getting 1% of the population, then 5%, then 10%, it's going up and up and up. And some of these western states now have 30% prevalence in their herds, and they're starting to see some decreases or declines in their deer populations. So it's nasty stuff. We don't know how to deal with it yet. It might be something we have to learn to live with, but it's yucky. You think I'm always dealing with just happy fun stuff, but yeah, sometimes we have heavy, hard-hitting stuff we got to deal with. All right. Okay. What I'm going to do, let me get out of this again, because that conversation led to another story that I want to get into, because I think you'll find it fascinating. At least I did. Gosh darn it. And here I'm always worried whether or not I'm going to have enough material, and I'm not even going to touch on everything. Now, some of you have probably read my blog. This, believe it or not, was up there, but I imagine a lot of people kind of skim over this one. But this was really interesting. Just curious, does anyone know what I'm going to talk about here with the glow-in-the-dark deer? Good. Hopefully this will be new to everybody. Okay, here it is. Working in Tennessee as the deer bear elk coordinator for the state of Tennessee. One of the wildlife officers, now the state of Tennessee there's wildlife officers all over the state, usually multiple officers in each county. And those officers are charged with a very difficult job. They not only have to care for the wildlife and enforce the wildlife laws, but they also enforce other civil laws. So they have just as much jurisdiction as a state trooper or a local police officer. They enforce all those laws if need be. They don't focus on that, but if they have to, they can do it. And one of the officers in a county in the northern part of Tennessee, Montgomery County, the officer called me up and said, "Hey, Daryl, I got something I got to show you." And he described over the phone, he's like, you won't understand until you see it in person. But he goes, he was tasked with an assignment about doing some drug enforcement. Apparently they're having some problems with some drug users, I think it is on a wildlife management area. And they received some money to purchase what's called thermal imaging equipment. Now, for those of you that don't know what thermal imaging is, if you've ever seen that television show called Cops, sometimes they will show some video footage from surveillance where they show a guy running down the street and he's glowing bright white. It looks like he's radioactive because he's glowing bright white. That is footage taken from a thermal imager. And the reason it looks like that is that camera does not record or view things in visible light. It's actually measuring the temperature of things within the screen. And so what that camera does, it assigns the coldest objects in the field of view, it assigns the color black. Whatever is the warmest in there is assigned the color white. And you have varying degrees from black to white. And so literally what it shows is whatever you're looking at, whatever is the hottest is glowing bright white. Now when you see that criminal running down the street and his body's glowing because his body's really warm, he's glowing, but you also see street lights and headlights and lots of things within the urban environment are hot. Pavement sometimes gets hot. So there's a lot of light pollution. There's a lot of whiteness in that screen. And so this officer was issued this thermal imaging equipment. And so for fun, he took it out at night. And it was after midnight, and he was driving around his county, which was a really rural county. And he wanted to see what he could see. And he said, "Daryl, You've got to see this. It is the most amazing thing. He goes, I would shine the camera in the field to see what I could see, and this is what it looked like. He said the animals, whatever animals were out there, they glowed bright white. Nothing else was glowing, just the animals. And so I drove out there, sure enough, like a few days later, so I could see for myself. And it was amazing. It was such an eye opener. Nobody was really doing any of this work before. But the reason this worked so well was because when you think about the natural environment, not the urban environment, but the natural environment with the trees and the rocks and the grass and everything, after the sun goes down, everything starts cooling off. The temperature dissipates in that natural environment. There's no energy source there like the city with lights and motors and everything like that. So in the natural environment, everything cools off except one thing, and that's warm-blooded animals. Warm-blooded animals usually maintain a body temperature in the 90s, maybe even the low hundreds. So they're like little fire engines. Their body is pumping out heat, even though the grass, the trees, the rocks, everything around them is nice and cool. And so this camera just went whoosh. It opened up a whole new world to us, because for a long, long time we had a lot of difficulty counting animals, just knowing how many animals are out there. Now, you've probably heard of wildlife agencies using spotlight surveys where they drive around with spotlights to try to count deer. And it's not very effective because that deer has to be looking at you for you to see the eye shine. If the deer's not looking at you, you can miss it really easily with a spotlight. With this thermal imaging, all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, the world just opened up to us. And so would you believe I literally spent about 4 years of my life doing research like this. And in fact, one of the coolest things, if you know anything about male deer, the bucks, whether or not it's a white-tailed deer or even an elk, when they're growing their antlers, the antlers are called, they're in velvet. So there's lots of blood flow. They're putting on lots of tissue up in their antlers all throughout the summertime. And the cool thing is when you use this thermal imager, even in the summertime, cools off at night, those bucks glow, their antlers glow. And so not only could we count the number of deer, but we could count the number of males, we could count the number of females. Because the fawns were so young, we could identify fawns. So we started doing, and like I said, I did it for about 4 years, where my 9 to 5 job was not 9 to 5. It was usually about 8 o'clock at night till about 3 o'clock in the morning, just driving the back roads of Tennessee. And it was really cool because I got to experiment with all sorts of neat things. We actually built these safari seats as I would drive all over. Obviously, I would have multiple people helping me, but we would literally drive all over to document animals. And here's the one thing that I'm going to offer to you that I think would be really cool. I think you'll enjoy it. Just like many of you have looked or have seen the bear behavior videos, I've got a number of thermal imaging videos that were just amazing to see, just to see how these deer react. A couple of them that come to mind, we videoed some large deer, large antlered deer, or large bucks that would be sitting in a cotton field. And most of the time, most people think when a deer sees you, it's going to run. Would you believe we documented them because of this camera? We couldn't have did it without it. When the deer does not think it's seen, and this camera does not cast a light, you're driving around in the dark. You could see everything, but you're not casting a light on the deer. We had bucks that would literally get down on their knees and try to get below the level of the field, whether or not it was cotton or soybean, and try to hide from us, even though we'd be really, really close. And to experience deer hiding from you was something we've never documented before. Another really cool thing, we would use a fawn in distress call to try to get a good look at the deer in case it wasn't looking at us. When you blow a fawn in distress call, the deer's head snaps around. They want to know what's going on, and we would blow that call, and you'd have deer running from, I swear, a half mile away looking for that fawn. It's just amazing to see the responses when these deer don't realize that they're being looked at when they are. And so it is amazing footage. What I'm going to do is, anyone on this presentation, I'll send you some of those videos just so you can see how cool some of these things were that we were doing. Now, another thing, many of you are familiar with Great Smoky Mountain National Park, right? Cades Cove is a really popular destination inside Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Besides seeing lots of bear, historically you could see lots of deer. They did have issues within the last couple of years where their deer population has dropped because of that EHD, not CWD, but EHD took a toll on deer in Cades Cove a few years ago. But historically, you could drive around and see deer all over the cove. When I was telling Bill Stiver about this thermal imaging equipment, he wanted to see for himself. And so historically, Bill and the other biologists within the park would do spotlight surveys. And so we arranged, and this was one of the cool things, because when everyone else would get kicked out of Cades Cove, me and the other biologists would go behind the gate and we would do these camera surveys. One truck would have 3 or 4 biologists in the back of a pickup truck with spotlights, and their goal was count as many deer as you can count driving the loop around Cades Cove. And then I was in this truck with my driver, and I had a recorder, so besides counting them, I could record it just to show what we're seeing. And so the spotlight truck was in front of us, and then the thermal imaging truck, and we drove kind of together side by side, and they counted deer, and I counted deer. When we got to the end, we did the whole loop, and the spotlight guys counted, and I'm going to misquote it here, but it is like 41 deer that they counted. And I had recorded 137 deer. And they're like, no way. There's no way that there's that many deer out here. And so we walked over to a field, and I said, shine this field and tell me how many deer are in there. And so they had all the spotlights going, and there's 4 deer in this field. And I said, there's 11 deer in this field. And the cool thing was, I had the camera there, I had the video screen, and I was just panning around. I'm like, all right, and we counted them up, and it made them believers instantaneously. It was awesome stuff, and that was really cool. And like I said, not many people know that, but I did that for about 3 or 4 years, trying to figure out how many deer we had in the state of Tennessee. All right, I'm looking at some comments. Let me catch up. Yeah, it was so very cool. The things that you learn when you can observe an animal without that animal being knowing that you're there is pretty amazing. Ton of deer, no bears. Sandy, just so you know, that's oddball, because this past year it seems like more and more people are seeing more bear than they are deer. Ginny, that's a great point, because one of the things they started doing since then is aerial thermal imaging surveys. And so you have to have really flat ground, which the Cove does have, but you have to have the fact that those horses and the deer, those are the 2 main large animals there. You can differentiate between a horse and a deer by the heat signature it gives. But if you were in an area that had elk and moose, it'd be hard to differentiate between all those. But in places where it works, they do use that aerial thermal imaging. Chanda, there was, I don't know if we were actually expecting to see a certain amount, but the main test there that we were doing was whether or not that thermal imaging camera could see more deer, and it absolutely, without a doubt, proved that. Jeannie, you asked about the issues with poachers or exotic animal trade. What is that in reference to? And as you're responding to that, I'm not done with my pictures here, because after we proved the worth of this thermal imaging camera, we started developing other surveys. And y'all know from my previous little talk, we had elk that we released in Tennessee. And after a number of years, people were wanting to know, how many elk do we have in Tennessee? And so now that we had this new technology, one of the coolest things I did was using that thermal imaging to figure out how many elk we had. And so we developed these surveys. That's not me, that's Dustin McCubbins. He was one of the managers up in North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area. But he's got a tracking device there, that aerial that's in his hand, because he was wanting to know if this animal behind him, that is what the heat signature from an elk looks like. And it looks a little weird. If you recall, let me go back. See how the deer, the whole body glows white, or almost the whole body is white? Now when you look at an elk, it's mostly the head that glows white. Can anyone guess why that is? Bigger? No, actually, what? More blood in the head. Very good guesses on both of those. But what it is, if you can picture an elk, and I don't have a good elk picture here, they have a real heavy mane. So real shaggy hair all along the elk, or all along the neck. And then it starts evening out as the body goes. And so because the neck is really insulated, you don't see the glow from the skin as much as you do on the head. And so deer don't have that thick of a mane around their neck, or in fact they don't have any mane, but elk generally have a really thick coat of hair all along their neck. That's why their head kind of stands out more. And that's how we would differentiate when we saw an animal in the woods, whether or not it was an elk or a white-tailed deer. Is really easy to differentiate. All right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back and look at some of these comments here, because I saw some come in. Okay, Jeannie, what you were going back to was the panther stuff and the exotic trait. Absolutely, without a doubt, 100%. Some sightings that have occurred, whether or not they're in the East Coast, West Coast, of panthers, or if it was an area of the state or an area of the country that didn't have cougars, some of that is attributed to illegal pet trade, because unfortunately people will buy stuff. It used to be legal. Thankfully, it's not anymore in most situations. But they'll buy these exotic animals, whether they're panthers or leopards or jaguars, and then after a while they get sick of caring for them, or something happens, and they turn them loose. Those animals don't last long, because usually they're either declawed or they don't know how to survive in the wild. But without a doubt, sometimes that happens. It's not often. It's pretty rare, but that could be a possibility. And one of the reasons I'm saying that is the city of Chattanooga, the cougar that they had on exhibit there for a number of years was one that was caught in the wild of Tennessee. And I just told you Tennessee does not have free-ranging cougars. What had happened is someone called about this cougar, and sure enough, there was a cougar, and the wildlife agents captured it. What it turned out to be is exactly what I said. It was someone's pet. They didn't want it anymore, so they dumped it out. The reason we knew it is because the cat was declawed. That cat didn't stand a chance in the wild. And so fortunately, the Chattanooga Zoo took it, and it became one of their display animals. And so that definitely happens. Okay, going back to some of the questions. Sandy asked, does the National Park Service do any kind of controlled hunt in order to keep the deer population down in Great Smoky Mountain National Park? Many of you will be happy to know the answer is no. The only thing that is hunted in Great Smoky Mountain National Park is wild hogs, because they're non-native. They should not be there. And so they do employ some hog hunters That's their job, is to kill as many of those wild hogs because they're so damaging to the environment and to the native species. And so all the other animals, the native animals there, they let nature balance it out. And and man was always a part of the landscape, but when you remove us, nature will figure it out. Mother Nature knows best, and she's cruel sometimes because sometimes the populations go up and then a disease will come through and knock them back down. And that's kind of what happened in the Cades Cove area with the deer. There's lots and lots of deer, and then a few years ago, EHD came through and knocked those populations way down. And so some people are happy that they're not hunted, but the animals will their populations will be controlled one way or the other. If man doesn't do it, then Mother Nature sure knows how to. Jeannie, there's lots of uses for the thermal imaging. It used to be that those cameras were about $10,000. The first camera I bought was $10,000, but they've come down considerably, and more people are using them. And there's lots of wonderful things that they can be used for. And now that they're so cheap, there's lots of not so wonderful things, because just as much as law enforcement has them, then the bad guys could have them too, so to speak. Yeah, Jenny, unfortunately, a lot of people, when they get tired of caring for an animal, they think it'll do just fine. It's actually cruel to release what was a captive animal, to release it to the wild, because in most situations those animals don't survive very long. They think they do, but they don't. Lori, that. Yeah, don't give my kids ideas. Fortunately, they don't have those ideas anymore. But that wasn't a thermal imaging equipment that had to capture Santa. That was just a regular old trail camera. Okay, let me look to see what other. I don't mind talking. I like I said, I love talking to you guys. I hope I don't bore you after a while. But let me get out of here and look to see what other stories I could share, and I'll give you a couple of options. All right. I could resort to some bear stories. Let me. Well, I have a catfish story. Many of you have read my catfish story. Um, there's there's also a story of Timber and Blaze. If you haven't heard that, those are the cubs from Arkansas. I could reiterate the Deacon story. We talk about the neonatals, or Lamb, the bear with no teeth. Um, Everyone knows Houdini. And what was, oh, the apple tree cubs, catching cubs. That was that same one. So, any of those strike your interest that you've never heard before? Okay, I'll. Okay, Jeannie asked a question. Wasn't there a blind bear? There was, but that came after me, so I was not part of that rehabilitation. That bear, I believe, was from the National Park Service, and I don't know what came of that, but that was an interesting story, and I wish I knew more about it, that I could tell you more details, but I don't. So, okay, tell you what, I'll do both Deacon and the Arkansas Cubs. I'll kind of go through the Deacon one a little bit faster, simply because I know many of you have heard that, but it is one of my favorite stories. But then I'll tell you about the Arkansas Cubs. So where did my PowerPoint presentation go? Okay, start with this. So Deacon was a little bear that was quite the surprise for me. Many of you have read the story of spooning a bear, but I'll elaborate a little bit more on the events that unfolded. But obviously this was brand new when the bear center was still only a couple years old. We only had done a few dozen bears, so we were still learning quite a bit on how to do things. And the one thing we always knew, the bear center was there designed to care for orphaned and injured wild bears. And so I received a call one night it was from a wildlife officer from Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and he told me of a cub that he had acquired, and I think this was up in Washington County. And so I had to drive. It was a good drive. It was a couple-hour drive to meet him in Northeast Tennessee. And back then, the agency vehicle was my Jeep. And so I took a dog carrier like you see in the picture here, and a catch pole and some gloves, because the officer described this bear being about 20, 25 pounds. And so drove up there, and the plan was to meet the officer in the parking lot of, I think it was a Kmart, and we were going to meet in the parking lot well after dark and exchange the bear. I was going to get the bear from him and then take that bear back to the bear center because it was an orphan bear. And so I showed up, and the officer greeted me, really nice guy, I forget what his name was, but he had the bear in the back of his pickup truck in a little cage. And so I went to retrieve the catch pole and these big heavy-duty gloves in case something went awry. And because usually with a wild bear cub, they are little Tasmanian devils. They will try to scratch and claw you and bite you. I've been bit by one before that I nicknamed Tyson. That's a different story. But they're literally pretty wiry creatures when they're wild. And so as I'm donning the gloves, walking over with the catch pole, the officer shot me a look. He's like, yeah, you don't need that. I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, watch this. And he opened the door, and it scared me. The cub ran out and jumped in his arms, and he caught the bear. And he was holding his knuckle out, and the bear was literally sucking on his knuckle and making, if you've never heard it, it's one of the most wonderful sounds. They hum. It's their form of purring, and it means they're comforted. They're having a good old time. They feel safe, and so it was suckling on the knuckle of his finger, and it was humming. And at first I was like, that's really cool, but then it dawned on me, this is really bad, because our agency was not supposed to take in habituated cubs. And so he loaded up the bear into my carrier and bid me farewell, and I was driving back to the bear center. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Because this is not a bear that we could typically release because it liked humans. It enjoyed being around humans. And so as I'm making phone calls to board members trying to figure out what we're going to do, I'm driving in the Jeep, and the pet carrier with Deacon was behind me, and as I'm driving, I could hear him do what I just did. He coughed. And at first I didn't notice, and then he coughed again. And as I'm driving, I'm like, bears don't cough. I've never heard of it, and I had dealt with a number of bears. I'm like, bears don't cough. And so I called up the board members. I said, hey, I just want to let you know there's something wrong. I want to get the bear checked out because it's coughing here. It doesn't sound too good. And so I took the bear to the University of Tennessee vet school. And lo and behold, Ed Ramsey was, back then as he is now, he was the vet. And so Dr. Ramsey met me at the vet school. We took the cub back there, and he was looking it over, and he's like, we got to get some x-rays. And so I waited out in the waiting room, and it was about an hour or so. Finally, Dr. Ramsey comes back, and he tells me, he's like, I got some bad news for you. He goes, your bear here has a really severe case of aspiration pneumonia. And I didn't really know exactly what that was. And he explained it to me. He's like, this is typical of someone bottle feeding the bear. So it confirmed our suspicion that he was raised by hand. And what had happened, whoever was raising him by hand wasn't holding the bottle right or didn't have a good designed bottle. And so as the bear was drinking the milk, it was going down the wrong pipe, getting all in his lungs. So his lungs were filled with fluid, literally milk, whatever they're feeding him. And he x-rayed it and he says his lungs are so clogged. He goes, Daryl, I hate to tell you this, but I don't think Deacon's gonna make it through the night. Oh my gosh, this completely blew me away. I wasn't expecting this. And so he gave me some antibiotics to treat it in hopes that the bear would get better. But he said, just when you go home, make sure the bear is comfortable, but just warn you that when you wake up tomorrow, there's a good chance the bear might not make it. So that was a tough drive home because here I had to care for this bear, and I felt so bad for it because I'm gonna swear, some dumbass fed this bear improperly, fed the bear number one, but did it in a way that just literally killed the bear. So I had driven back to the bear center at the time. There was no facility. There was some enclosures. There was a single wide trailer, which was my house, the office, the volunteer center. Everything was in that single wide trailer. And then there was a little maintenance building. It was a little cinder block building, and they still have it there. I think that's the Cub Nursery now. And so I put Deacon down in there. I changed cages, put him in a little bit bigger cage, but put him in the maintenance building. And so I'm thinking, whenever I would handle a bear, we would do everything we could to keep that bear wild. So all the foods would be all natural. We did supplement their diet with dog food occasionally to help them grow faster, but we were giving them apples and berries and acorns, everything that they would naturally find in the wild because we wanted to reinstill what they should be eating. And so at first I was reaching for that stuff, and I said, you know what? This is this bear's last night probably, so I think I'm gonna do something that I shouldn't do. So I ran up to my house, got a jar of peanut butter, some other goodies that a bear probably should not eat, but if this was going to be his last meal, I was going to make sure he was going to enjoy it. And so I went down there and I fed him all this stuff, and he loved it. He was inside his cage eating this stuff all up, and he just had the most wonderful last meal that he was going to have. And so I was all done. He finished eating, and it was about 10 o'clock at night. And so I was leaving the maintenance building, and I shut the light off. And as I was walking out, closing the door, he started bawling. He saw me leaving, and he was just screaming for me. And I remember closing the door, and even behind the door, I could hear him bawling. And I walked back up to where I lived, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I was just sitting there saying, I can't live with myself knowing that this bear, it might be its last few hours, and knowing that I comforted him. He was calm when I was with him. So I told my wife, I said, I'm going to go back down and just hang out with him for a little bit. So I went back down there in the maintenance building, and as soon as I came in, he settled down. He was just so happy to see me again. And so I walked over, and I stuck my finger through the cage, just like that officer did, and he would suckle on the end of my knuckle. And sure enough, he was just so comforted. He loved being around people and literally being with someone. And so there's this crazy idea in the back of my mind. I'm like, all right, how often do you get to do this? I already saw the officer do it once, and I was literally afraid because I never handled a bear before. This is the first one that I actually had hands-on experience because these wild cubs, you don't handle them at all. And so I delicately opened the door, and I swung it open, and he just bolted out and jumped in my lap, and literally is like a little old bear hug. He just curled up in my lap, and sure enough, he was humming. I'm getting all sentimental here, but he just loved being in my lap. So I thought that was really cool. I hung out with him for about an hour or so, and he got down off my lap, and he was playing around, but he just loved being around me. And so at this time, it's getting later and later and later. I was probably with him for a couple hours, so it was around midnight, maybe after midnight. And I'm like, all right, now I really got to get to bed because I was starting to get tired. And so I'm like, all right, I got to get him back in his cage. So I did my best at picking him up without him realizing what was going on. And I walked over to the cage and I reached to put him in, and he went spread eagle, grabbed all four corners of the door of the cage, and I'm trying to push him in, and it was like a little trampoline because he was not going back in that cage. And he was screaming because he didn't want to go back in. And so he got down, and all of a sudden he ran to me and just hugged me. He grabbed my leg and just hugged me. And when he's hugging me, squeezing me, you can feel his claws digging in. I'm like, I'm in here with a bear. And he was only 25 pounds, but they're still really powerful animals. And obviously he's not declawed or anything. And so I'm like, oh, what do I do now? And so I decided to hang out with him a little longer. And fortunately, we had some a tarp, and I think there was like a bag of dog food that I could use as a pillow. And I just laid down while he just played around by me. And sure enough, uh, sleep finally fell over me, and I fell asleep. And so I remember waking up, and I realized it was the next morning. And I was just getting consciousness myself, and I realized where I was in the maintenance building, and and I didn't yet open my eyes. And sure enough, I opened my eyes, and he was asleep in front of me, literally spooned up. I was spooned up against him, and he had his head on my arm, literally just snoring away. And so when I tell you I was spooning a bear, I literally spooned a bear for this adventure. And so I was able to quickly grasp him, put him back in his cage, close the door. And literally at that moment, because he was still sleeping, and it dawned on me that he survived. And the night before, I didn't tell you, but I had given him his medicines, and so he survived. So I gave him another round of medicine, and sure enough, I called Dr. Ramsey. I said, "Hey, he made it." And Dr. Ramsey said, that's a really good sign." And sure enough, days went by, a few weeks went by, and he cleared up. His lungs cleared of that fluid. We took him back in the X-ray, and his lungs were really good. Great news was that he was alive. Bad news was we still had no idea what we were going to do with him. This bear, fortunately, and we were talking a little bit before this started, you usually cannot find a home for a bear. There's no zoos that want to take him. There's no sanctuaries that want to take him. Fortunately, we did find one in Georgia that had just lost a bear that we received permission to drive that bear down to the sanctuary in Georgia. And so I had Deacon with me probably a couple of months before we were able to make that transfer. And so it was pretty awesome. That was like the only bear that I ever had that close physical hands-on contact with, because all those other wild bears I dealt with, they would tear you apart if they could. So that's my Deacon story. I had the wrong screen on in case anyone wrote anything, but I'll take a look. All right, I'm trying to catch up here. Kelly says, are there still states where having bears, etc., as pets is legal? I don't know if there still are. They're getting fewer and farther between. And I will tell you a story. 1997, when I first started working at the Bear Center, so less than 20 years ago, I remember getting a call from a couple in Indiana who they said they were driving through the state, and someone alongside the road was selling a bear cub, and it was legal. You could own it in Indiana 20 years ago. I don't know if that is still legal, but they thought it was the coolest thing. So they bought a little black bear cub. They took it home, and they called me because they said, the bear now weighs 150 pounds. It's bigger than our daughter, and we don't know what to do with it. You talk about wanting to strangle someone. How could you not realize that a bear is going to grow up? And so whether or not there's still states, I wish I had a concrete answer. I do know that more and more states were making it illegal for just people to own those animals, unless you got a class 1 license for dangerous animals, but it's usually super, super hard to get that license. One of the bears at Paws near me was Baylor mascot bear before rescue. Um, there's a lot of places. The one thing you do have to watch out for is it's usually illegal to have native wildlife, so you cannot own a black bear. Unfortunately, it's much easier to get permits to own exotic wildlife. So animals that are not native here, it's actually easier for you to own. And unfortunately, like many places, I know for a long, long time there was places in Pigeon Forge that would have bears on display, and those were Asiatic black bears. And so, yeah, I wish we had better control over who could own what and get rid of as much of that as we possibly could. But I know it still happens, unfortunately. Was Deacon ever able to have cubs? Um, I'm trying to remember. This is so bad, but I'm fairly certain Deacon was a boy. But I don't know. I don't think that they bred at that facility. Most sanctuaries are not allowed to do any type of breeding program. And so I doubt that had taken place, whether or not Deacon was a male or a female. And for some reason, I can't remember for certain. Yeah, surely the ones in Cherokee, North Carolina, I always got questions on those as well. Okay, what was my other one? My other one was going to be, oh, the Arkansas Bears. Let me just go to that slide really quick. All right, I'm sure a few of you know this story. Again, and Kelly, I'm gonna. I hope these stories are pulling it. I'm not crushing anyone with any stories. No sad stories coming out of me tonight. But um, what was really cool, many of you might know the story, but a few may not. This is one of the coolest stories that I had rehabilitating cubs while at the Bear Center. It's a story of Timber and Blaze. And again, the Bear Center was really young. This is late 1990s. And I received a call from David Goad, who was the bear biologist for the state of Arkansas. And he said, I heard of your facility. Again, we were brand new. Nobody really knew about us. So how he heard about us, I don't know, but I'm thankful. But he said, I heard you rehabilitate black bears. He goes, I got a couple of cubs here that I would love to send your way because we don't have any facility in Arkansas. Would you be able to take them? And I said, sure, as long as I could get the clearing from Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. He's like, well, let me tell you something. One of the cubs is going to need some medical attention. And then he told me the story of Timber and Blaze. And it went like this. There was, and I'm going to use the French word again, there was a dumbass that wanted to catch some cubs. And so apparently there was a mother with a couple of cubs. He had killed the mother, and the cubs scurried up to the top of a tree. Don't worry, they caught this guy, bad guy. But the cubs had scurried up to the top of a tree, and he wanted to capture them. And so he did what he thought was a logical way of getting the cubs down. He decided to cut the tree down. And so as the tree fell, the cubs obviously fell with the tree. And the female, there's a male and a female. The female bear, which is on the right-hand side of this picture, during the fall when the tree came down, she broke both of her back legs. Her femur on both sides snapped. And they knew this. They knew that there was something wrong with her back legs. And so David Goad from Arkansas said, you're going to have to get some medical attention for this female cub. I said, sure, we'll do whatever we need to do. So unfortunately, in the government world, nothing moves really quickly. And so by the time we got all the paperwork, everything all set, it was a number of days before they were able to deliver the cubs I forget where in Arkansas it was, but it was a long drive to go from Arkansas all the way to East Tennessee. And so it was literally a period of 4 or 5 days after this injury took place that they finally delivered the cubs to the bear center. And so she was in a small cage, so she wasn't running around hurting herself. They were able to feed her. But as soon as I got my hands on her, I took her to the University of Tennessee to do x-rays to figure out how they're going to fix her legs, whether or not they're going to put plates on the bones or pins, insert pins into her femur, what they're going to do to fix her broken back legs. And Dr. Ramsey again took the x-rays, and he came out and he showed me, and he's like, "I got bad news." He said, "It's been so long since the accident that the femur, when it broke, it'd be nice if it broke and there was a fracture in the femur. But when the femur broke, it separated a little bit and it moved down, and the two bones were overlapping like that. And sure enough, there was callus. They started fusing together already." And he said he didn't want to go in there and break because he didn't know how that would break if he tried breaking that again. He said, "Let's just see how this heals." And so he gave me pain medications, antibiotics, just to make sure that the bear was comfortable. And he sent it back to me. The male bear was doing just fine. I think Timber was the male bear. We put him in the main enclosure, but Blaze with the broken back legs, we kept in a confinement cage because Dr. Ramsey said make sure she doesn't crawl around and injure her legs over the next 3 or 4 weeks, and we'll see how this heals. So sure enough, gave her the medication. Her legs started healing. She was pretty soon crawling all over the inside of her cage. No issues. You could tell she was kind of gimpy because her legs were a little shrunken because the bone was shortened because it fused improperly. But as far as her activity level and eating and playfulness, she was bouncing around like crazy. And so Dr. Ramsey took her again, x-rayed her again, and sure enough, those legs, there was tremendous healing. They were solid, but they were a little crooked. They're like fat, both back legs. But he says they're as solid as they're going to get. And sure enough, a couple of weeks after that, just to make sure, we released her into the large pen and reunited her with her brother. And would you believe that that little gimpy bear with the 2 broken back legs could climb a tree faster than any other bear in that enclosure, up and down all over the place? It is amazing to see the healing process and the speed at which these animals heal. Because you have to think about it, if they're in the wild and they get injured, they either heal quickly or they die. And so the fact that we were able to provide not just the medicine but the food and shelter that she needed for her to heal quickly, it was such a cool thing to see this male and female sibling running around playing together, knowing everything that they went through to get to that point. And so I remember calling David Goad in Arkansas, and I said, "Hey, whenever you're ready, you got a couple of young bears that are ready to be released." And he was surprised at how quickly I called him back. She gained weight really quick. Both bears were around that 50-pound mark when we returned them to Arkansas. And sure enough, he said when they opened that door back in the territory that they came from, they both ran out and took off. And as far as they know, those bears did lived happily ever after. Excuse me. I knew I'd get to this point. All right, let me scroll down. Yeah. Jeannie, you asked about any medical attention or pain meds until they arrived. I'm sure Arkansas did something for them. I don't know if they had any high dose medication, but more than likely they were given. You could give acetaminophen, just pain relievers that humans take. Sometimes you could give that to the wild animals. I think I'm done. Yeah, those I will tell you without a doubt, it's those stories that leave the deepest marks. I rehabilitated. I was only I was only there for about less than 5 years, but I was fortunate to rehabilitate 43 bears. And it's stories like those that really leave the impression when you know without a doubt whatsoever that bear would not make it without the bear center to help it out. Yeah, it's always awesome to release those animals. All right, let me see if there's one more. We'll try to wrap it up. Again, I was worried that I wouldn't have enough material. Let me see what I got here really quick. I'll do one short one, but I gotta see what I have first. And then we're gonna call it a night so I can go get some cough medicine. All right. What? Yeah, the good thing is I still have more stories that I could talk another 4 hours, but I won't do that. All right, I'll end it, and many of you know this bear as well, but a few of you may not. I'll end it on one of my other favorite bears because I wish I knew what was going on with this one. If you've never heard the story before, this bear came from I can't remember what road it came from, but it was believed to have been hit by a car. It didn't experience any. It wasn't injured, no broken bones, but they found it along the roadway, kind of dazed. And so this was one of the earlier bears that I got at the bear center. And so he was tiny. He was about 15 pounds. And so they brought him to us. And the good thing is he was acting fine. He was eating well. 15 pounds. All right, what we're going to do, we're going to throw him into the enclosure with all the other cubs, fatten him up, and sure enough, we'll send him back on his way. And so because of where he was found alongside the road, we nicknamed him Freeway. And so typically whenever we got a cub that was anywhere from 15 to 20 pounds, we would only have them a couple of months. And they would fatten up really quick and get to be about 50, 60 pounds. And then we would release them. We wanted them to spend the least amount of time at the center as possible because they belonged in the wild, not in the center. So as long as we got them fattened up, they would do just fine. And so we put Freeway in there with a bunch of other cubs his size. So there's multiple cubs in there that weighed about 15, 20 pounds. And we would pour on the food from the acorns and the berries and the fish, a little bit of dog food in there to really fatten them up quickly. And the bears grew. And so we had all these other bears from Cherokee to Houdini to all these other cubs that were in there with him, and they're fattening up, and we're releasing them, and we're looking. He's still 15 pounds, and he's not growing. And I remember spending days just to document that he was eating. Like at first, we were thinking maybe all the other bears are eating the food before he's getting it, but he would eat just as much as the other bears would eat. And for some reason, he just didn't want to grow. I swear, I would love, if we knew that bear was going to stay that size, that would be the perfect mascot. But we had him for about 6 months, and he did gain a few pounds, but nothing like any of those other bears. And I remember talking to Kim Delosier. I said, what do we do with Freeway? And Kim was familiar with this bear. It was the exact same time I was going through my escapades with Houdini, so Kim Delosier was there quite a bit. And I asked him, what do we do with Freeway? Because he is not growing. He's been here almost 6 months, and we just can't keep, we're not set up to keep a permanent resident there. And so Kim arranged it so apparently Freeway and Houdini had developed some kind of bond. They hung out in the same tree quite often. And so once we got Houdini back that second time because of my first fiasco, um, those bears hung around together, and we ended up releasing Freeway and hoping that him and Houdini would stick together. But that was one of the coolest bears. He was, you could see how cute he was. He was just a really cool bear. I wish I could tell you what was wrong with him. Obviously, what Kim and I concluded, um, because they were usually given the medication to deworm and all that. You have to understand Mother Nature. There's all sorts of ailments that befalls wild animals, much like humans, and there's certain conditions that prevent an animal from growing. And so we believe this bear was kind of like the runt of the litter, and so we didn't think he was never gonna grow to be very large, but we felt that him having a life in the wild was a whole lot better than finding a home for him. Now, understand, he's a small bear. As long as he acts like a small bear, he could do just fine because you have raccoons and other small creatures that do just fine. But we decided a life in the wild for him was much better. And so when we put Freeway and Houdini together in a den when we released them back into the wild. And so, anyway, Freeway was a really cool bear. I wish I knew what happened to him. Or, well, I don't know if I wish I knew what happened to him, but he was definitely one of my favorites. So with that, I think I'm going to try to get some medicine, and I'll sit here and answer whatever questions you have. But it's been wonderful talking to you. Again, I always worry about not having enough material, but I still have about a dozen other stories in the hopper I could share. Yeah, Trish, he was definitely. It was funny because whenever he was wet, he looked like one of those wild-haired cat pictures, and so he was definitely a neat little bear. I will be better. Thank you for all the well wishes. So I just swallowed something wrong there, so that cough wasn't so much a sickness more than it was just got something caught in my throat. Anyway, what I'll do, anyone that's on here, thank you so much for joining in. Um, I don't know if I'll get the thank you email out tonight, but if I don't do it tonight, I'll do it tomorrow. But I'll definitely include some of those videos. I think those thermal imaging videos, I think you'll get a kick out of it. And it's one of those things where yeah, when you see it for the first time, you're like, wow, this is really, really cool. And so some of the footage, and now I understand it's going to be mostly deer stuff, but that was my world for a number of years. And it's just really neat when you can view an animal in a different kind of format that is not intrusive in that animal's life. They do things that sometimes you would never predict. So, thank you so much, and I apologize for the sickness. I knew I was going to struggle through this, so I appreciate you hanging in with me. Now I will be sending emails out shortly. Oh wait! Nobody go yet. Um, I probably don't even have to show this to most of you, but uh, everyone knows where to go for the website, so you could sign up for classes. Leave comments if you want to leave comments. Most of you have already done that. Just so you know what the upcoming classes are, Robert Brewer, who's a fantastic teacher, he was my counterpart with New Mexico students in Tennessee. Some of you saw his Backyard Critters webinar. He's a wonderful, wonderful speaker. Thursday, September 13th, so 2 weeks from today, he's going to be teaching about rebounding wildlife. These are success stories, not just of things he's worked with, but all over North America. It could be I don't even know what he's going to talk about, to be truthful, but it could be about returning white-tailed deer. It could be about grizzly. It could be about river otter. There's so many different success stories about how we're bringing wildlife back from the brink. And so Robert's going to lead that one. Have utter faith in him, and he's going to do a fantastic job for that. A lot of you are signed up for it, but you'll see an email about that. And then a couple weeks after that, I'm going to do Sly as a Fox. A lot of people wanted to hear a webinar, an instructional webinar about the life of a fox. So I'll take those reins over. Never done that before. I got to put that presentation together, but I'm sure it'll be just fine once I get that done. But that's September 25th. It's a Tuesday. And then I had originally planned on doing my Super Sleepers webinar, which is the look at black bear hibernation. It's Thursday, October 4th, but I was invited to a conference in South Carolina that week. It's the Southeastern Outdoor Press Association. It's like outdoor writers and educators. They invited me to this conference, and I took them up on that offer. And so Stephanie Dennis, many of you have heard her teach before. She's going to take that class for me while I'm away at that conference. But those are the next three coming up. You'll see emails. Tell your friends, get anyone that's interested in wildlife to join in, because it's a great way to spend an hour or two in the evening instead of just watching old science